Jennifer Landheich, and I am the director of the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. We are funded by the Office on Violence Against Women as part of the Department of Justice to provide training and technical assistance on the issue of stalking. So I'm here to talk to you today about stalking risk assessment. And I want to first point out our website at SPARC, which is stalkingawareness.org, where you can find additional material that will help you in your work with both offenders and, more importantly, victims in these particular situations. So if you want to check out our work, there's guides for practitioners, so for law enforcement, for prosecutors, for advocates, as well as additional training modules, very similar to this one, as well as others. So please check out our work. What we're going to talk about today as far as stalking risk assessment is we want to talk a little bit about stalking and dangerousness in general. We know that stalking, in addition to being associated with intimate partner homicide, is also associated with things like physical and sexual assault, with explicit threats towards victims and property damage. I know that a lot of stalking cases actually come in and get flagged, first of all, as property crimes, as well as associated with threats with a weapon. So we're going to talk a little bit today about what does that dangerousness look like? What does it look like for stalking response in general? And how do we assess risk in stalking cases? So one of the things that we know is, as compared to domestic violence and sexual assault, that when we look at the response to stalking, despite the very high prevalence rates, the prevalence rates are that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men will experience stalking at some point in their lifetime. Despite those prevalence rates, we know that oftentimes within the criminal and civil justice system, even advocacy support, that oftentimes stalkers' actions are overlooked. They're minimized. We don't see formal or informal supports supporting at rates that we would like them to be supporting victims of stalking. So understand that despite the very high prevalence rates, that we see prosecutions and convictions for stalking remaining pretty low, and that oftentimes there are numerous harms that are associated with stalking cases, including continued stalking and harassment, both social and financial harm, a concept that we call life sabotage, and we'll cover that more in a little while, as well as harm to people that are close to the victims. So family members, anybody that's in the victim's social circle, etc. And as we look at these particular harms, one of the things that we know is that risk and threat assessment in stalking cases isn't as prevalent as risk assessment in intimate partner homicide cases or in intimate partner violence cases. And so one of the things that we want to be thinking about when it comes to risk assessment is exactly what does risk assessment tell us? And so know that when we're doing risk assessment, especially as it relates to stalking, that this assessment oftentimes will help us pinpoint which individuals demonstrate a risk at a particular moment in time. The really important thing to consider when we talk about risk assessment is that risk assessment is looking at the risk at this particular moment in time, but risk is dynamic. It's constantly changing. And so one of the things that we have to be thinking about is, perhaps if we're doing a risk assessment on a stalking case, when a victim first accesses services, and then the case continues and it starts to go through the criminal justice system, et cetera, that initial assessment of risk that's done at the very beginning of the case isn't valid 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 months down the line, because risk changes. And unfortunately, what we know is, as many of us are getting involved, including the criminal justice system, that level of risk often goes up. We'd like to think it goes down, but we know that as we're looking at accountability for offenders in these particular cases, oftentimes the risk goes up because we have an offender that may be going to jail, they may be losing their job, there are other risks that are associated with that accountability. And so oftentimes that level of risk is changing. So keep in mind that when we're looking at risk assessment, especially in stalking cases, it has to be an ongoing effort. And that threat level is never fixed. It's constantly changing. The other thing that we have to consider is, I'm going to talk a little bit about risk assessment tools in these particular cases, but that victims are the best predictor of reassault, better than any type of risk management tool. And so while the tools are fantastic and obviously something that we want people to use, What we also have to keep in mind is that victims are the experts on their own lives, that their perception of risk is usually spot on. So even if you use a tool and you determine that the level of risk is not heightened, et cetera, if you are working with somebody and they say to you, I believe this person's going to harm me or kill me, we need to listen, because their perception and their prediction of risk is usually better than any type of tool that we can come up with. What we also have to consider is that risk in stalking cases oftentimes is focused on intimate partners. And what we also have to hold in that particular space is that not all stalking cases are perpetrated by a current or former intimate partner. In fact, it's about half of stalking cases involve a current or intimate partner. So using intimate partner assessments in stalking cases is valid for half of the cases, but for those cases that aren't intimate partner perpetrators, we have to consider that we need to be using additional risk assessments, right? An intimate partner risk assessment isn't applicable unless it's an intimate partner stalking case. And that sounds pretty simple, but what we've found across the country is that oftentimes we'll go places and people will name the risk assessment tools that they're using in stalking cases and their intimate partner assessments. So that's not applicable unless you have an intimate partner situation. The other thing that we need to be thinking about is that oftentimes risk assessments in intimate partner situations are very focused on those factors like if the victim is separating from the offender, if there's access to weapons. And while those are also risk factors in stalking cases, we have to keep in mind that in intimate partner assessments, that stalking behavior might be either unidentified or underestimated. And so one of the things that we'll talk about today is how do we identify some of the stalking questions in intimate partner assessments, and what happens if we identify that that stalking is going on? Should we be doing additional risk assessment that helps us pinpoint the risk factors that are specific to the stalking behavior? So understanding that as we are looking at these risk assessments, identifying risk is one piece of it, but most importantly, also looking at increased safety planning depending on that risk that we have determined. When we look at identifying stalking behaviors and doing risk assessment in stalking, it's really important that we have a very comprehensive understanding of what stalking is in general. And one of the things that we know happens oftentimes is even those of us that have been doing this work for a really long time have a tendency to pinpoint behaviors in stalking cases based on surveillance behavior. And we know that individuals who experience stalking experience a variety of tactics from the offender, including the things that you see on your screen. And this particular framework is something that we refer to as the SPLY framework. And it stands for surveillance, life invasion, interference through some kind of sabotage or attack, and intimidation. And one of the things that we want to figure out when we're working on stalking risk assessment is to make sure that we are assessing all the behaviors that happen in a stalking case. And so for surveillance behaviors, that's oftentimes the stereotypical behaviors that people think of when it comes to stalking, where you have an offender who's following the victim, they're waiting someplace where they know the victim frequents. So job, the gym, restaurant or bar where the victim hangs out, place of worship, and so that they can accidentally or coincidentally run into the victim. And they might also be using things like tracking software or obtaining information about the victim from friends, from social media, or engaging in what we call proxy stalking, where you use a third party to gather information. And what we know from both research and from decades of working with survivors is that when the surveillance behavior is happening, victims of stalking are more likely to identify that something's wrong. They might not use the word stalking, and in fact, they usually don't, or use the word harassment, but they identify that what's happening to them isn't okay. And so they're more likely to come forward and to report either to law enforcement, to a victim advocate, to their friends and family. And when that is happening, what we as responders are also more apt to understand that this is a stalking situation. And so the cases that involve surveillance are often the cases that end up going through the criminal justice system. But in addition to the surveillance behavior, we also have to be thinking about the other parts of this particular framework. So thinking about the life invasion where the offender is making phone calls where they're humiliating the victim. So that might be in public, causing a scene, or it might be things like posting stuff on social media or spreading rumors or harassing their friends and family. We also see that in intimidation cases, that's going to be a little bit more familiar to all of us, especially if we're working on intimate partner violence cases, where the offender is engaging in property damage, they're threatening to harm themselves or somebody close to the victim, or they're engaging in what we call symbolic violence. And symbolic violence is just violence that means something to the victim that might not mean something to other people. So for example, it might be sending flowers to the victim at work after they break up. And the card on the flowers says, "I will always love you." At least that's how most of us read it. But the victim reads it as, "I will always love you," and takes that particular gesture, the sending of the flowers, which most people think is romantic or a kind gesture, as something completely different. It means something to them. That's an example of symbolic violence. And then last but not least, we have the interference through some kind of sabotage or attack of the victim's life. So it might be sabotaging the victim's finances, ruining their credit, showing up at work all the time. And so the victim ends up losing their job. What we know happens in a lot of stalking cases is there are not the same protections for stalking victims as there are for, say, victims of intimate partner violence. And so a victim of stalking might tell their employer what's going on, and the employer might say, "We don't need those kind of problems here," and ends up firing the victim. Or it could be things like keeping the victim from leaving a certain location, attacking their pets, etc. And what we need to keep in mind is that when we're working with victims of stalking, oftentimes people ask those victims, have there been previous incidents of harassment or stalking? And while the intent of that question is really good, unfortunately, what we know from research is that victims don't identify all these behaviors that you see listed on the screen as stalking. And so if you ask them, are there other incidents of harassment or stalking, they're oftentimes going to say, no, this is the only incident. Which, if we're working on a crime that involves a pattern of behavior, so keep in mind that stalking is a pattern of behavior that's directed at a specific person that would cause them to feel fear or experience emotional distress. If we're working on a crime that involves a pattern of behavior and we only have one incident, it's likely that we can't address that. And so one of the things that we have to keep in mind is, rather than asking victims, have you been stalked before or have you been harassed before, if we use something like the SPY framework to name the specific behaviors, to say to victims, has that person been showing up someplace? Have they damaged your property? Are they trying to ruin your reputation? Are they monitoring your social media? Then victims often say, oh yeah, well, all that's happening, but they don't identify that they're being stalked. And so if we're asking specific questions about these behaviors, then victims are much more likely to say, oh, yeah, that's happening. And then we have additional incidents that we can use to establish our course of conduct. So if we're accurately going to do risk assessment, we have to understand all the behaviors and all the tactics that stalking offenders engage in as part of their behavior and as part of their stalking. So keep in mind that using a framework like the SLY framework can be really helpful in understanding all the different tactics that offenders are using. And all of these are important, and all of these may indicate risk. So we have to have that good basis of understanding of what exactly stalking is to accurately be able to do the assessment. One of the things I would point you to is on SPARC's website, on the stalkingawareness.org website, there are several documents that highlight these particular SLY behaviors. So you can use those documents to ask questions and a safety plan and to identify risk in these particular cases. What we want to also think about is intimate partner femicide and stalking. And so as we look at the connection between both domestic violence or intimate partner violence and stalking, one of the things that we want to highlight is that many of the IPV assessments that are used in the United States that are highlighted on the DV RISC website have questions that may indicate stalking, some of which require a heightened response depending on the assessment, some of which are just additional indicators. But making sure that we identify that these are naming stalking behaviors is really important. And usually when we're doing training and we're asking people, no matter what assessment they're using, if they're using the danger assessment, if they're using the lethality assessment, depending on what they're using, most people will identify that the question about following someone or spying on someone has to do with stalking. But what we also need to keep in mind is the questions that highlight things like controlling and jealous behavior, or destroying property, or obsession with a victim, or asking about threats and intimidation. Those are also asking about stalking behaviors. Those fit in that SLY framework that we just talked about. And so if you're using an intimate partner assessment, violence risk assessment, no matter which assessment you're using, and one of these particular questions that you see on the screen are resulting in a yes answer or an indicator on those particular assessments, that's oftentimes your clue that you should also be looking at and delving deeper into the stalking behavior. And so one of the things that oftentimes happens in risk assessment in domestic violence cases and in intimate partner violence cases in general is that when the stalking behavior is happening, we often name it as or chalk it up to part of the control that happens in domestic violence cases. And so if there is a victim who is saying that the offender is really jealous and they're really controlling and they're monitoring their social media and they're showing up at their work and they're interfering with their relationships, that they're threatening the victim, that if they ever leave, they'll follow them and make them return to that relationship. That absolutely is part of domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And it's probably also stalking behavior. What oftentimes happens in these cases is when victims and offenders are still together, when that jealous and controlling behavior happens, people chalk it up to the power and control in an intimate partner situation. It is, and it might also be a course of conduct directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear or experience emotional distress. It might also be stalking behavior. And oftentimes people don't identify it as stalking behavior until the victim has left the situation. And then if the offender is showing up and trying to get the victim back in their lives, et cetera, then people might actually name it as stalking. But it's also stalking when it happens within the context of intimate partner violence. Just don't often name it as that. And some of you might be thinking, is it really important? I mean, does it matter whether we name it as domestic violence or stalking? It is important because what we know is when we have situations that involve both intimate partner violence and stalking, we have some of our most dangerous situations. Those are the situations that are high risk. And what we know is that when we look at the behavior that these offenders engage in, that surveillance behavior that we talked about earlier, the following, the monitoring, et cetera, several studies indicate that that particular behavior is associated with severe violence, and that very often women who report that their offender who has followed them, who spied on them, are more likely to experience either attempted or actual homicide by that partner. And keep in mind that that surveillance might be from the stalker themselves, but might also be done through a proxy stalker. So somebody else who's providing information to the offender. So when we have those intimate partner stalkers, those individuals are much more likely to physically approach the victim. They're more likely to be interfering with the victim. They're more likely to threaten things that the victim values as important because they have that information from being in that relationship. They're also more likely to use weapons. And what we oftentimes know is that in stalking cases, yes, absolutely, firearms are a concern, but we also see knives used very frequently in stalking violent situations. These same offenders are offenders who escalate really quickly. They go from 0 to 10 right away. And so that quick escalation and the fact that they're much more likely to reoffend calls for some additional risk assessment. We know that in a lot of stalking cases, the offenders who are going to keep on doing what they're doing are the intimate partner offenders. Not to say that in stalking situations, it might not be an acquaintance offender or someone else, but what we oftentimes see is it's these intimate partner offenders who are more likely to cause additional risk to the victim. As we look at what that looks like in these particular situations, we know that in 85% of attempted and 76% of completed intimate partner femicides, we have a male who murders a female victim, there has been an episode of stalking that occurred in the year prior to the attack. But if you go back to that power and control wheel and you name those jealous, controlling behaviors as just part of the intimate partner violence, and we never name it as stalking, we never charge or arrest for it as stalking, and most importantly, we don't safety plan around it, then we miss the opportunity to intervene in some of these cases that can be incredibly dangerous. Most of you probably identify that the intimate partner violence cases that you work with have some element of stalking. But do you name it? Do you include it in your police reports? Do you charge it if you're a prosecutor? For the advocates that are looking at this particular webinar, are you safety planning around it? Because what we know is that stalking is a lethality risk, and in fact, it's in one of the top 10 lists of intimate partner homicide risks. So this is a meta-analysis. It's an analysis of, it was 17 or 18 intimate partner femicide reports or studies that were done by academics. And what they did is compile the top 10 risk factors for intimate partner homicide. And most of the things that are on this list are things that you have probably had training on or have heard in other intimate partner risk situations, where it's access to weapons, if the offender has threatened the victim with a weapon, if there's been strangulation or forced sex or forced sexual assault in these particular situations. But keep in mind that the number 8 risk factor is perpetrating stalking. Victims who are victims of intimate partner homicide and stalking are in 3 times greater danger of being killed by that offender. But if we never named it as stalking, if we never did that charging, that arresting, that safety planning, then we missed the opportunity to intervene in some of these situations. I would also argue that as we look at this list, that number 5, number 9, probably number 6 are also indicators of stalking. And so understanding that, yes, we might be more comfortable with our response to intimate partner violence. We might have more confidence in our criminal justice system. We might be better at safety planning. But when we introduce stalking as part of that intimate partner violence, it calls for increased safety planning and increased risk identification. To that end, one of the things that we know from looking at stalking risk assessment is that oftentimes, in addition to intimate partner violence situations, we have individuals who are being stalked who are not part of an intimate partner situation. They're being stalked by an acquaintance or a family member, et cetera. And that doing risk assessment in those cases is equally as important. The assessment that SPARC recommends to folks as we do training across the country is the SHARP assessment. And I know there's other videos on this particular website that you can look at, including one from Dr. Logan, where she's talking about stalking risk assessment. And this particular assessment was developed by Dr. Logan to identify risk in stalking cases. And it is beneficial in a couple of different ways. The way that I find it most beneficial is I have been doing this work for about 26 years, and early on in my career, and even now, when people describe certain situations, you kind of have that gut feeling, like you just know that this isn't a great case and you're worried that something is going to. Risk assessment in general, when it first started decades ago, was very helpful for me because it really helped me identify the things that I knew in my gut were of concern in these particular situations, but that I couldn't always articulate to other people. And I remember having conversations with my prosecutor where I'd go to them and be like, I just have this really bad feeling, and I really think that this offender needs to stay in jail. And my prosecutor kind of tongue in cheek would be like, really, Jennifer, you want me to stand in front of a judge and be like, Jen has a bad feeling about this case, so we should ask for a higher bail? Like, that's not going to fly. And so what risk assessment oftentimes does is give us the actual risk factors that are happening in these cases to be able to articulate why we have such a concern. And the nice thing about SHARP is that it gives you two different things. It gives you the narrative report and the risk profile, but it also gives you safety planning suggestions. And I know many of you are going to be like, I am very skilled in safety planning. I don't need a safety plan to tell me how to safety plan with victims. And yes, you probably are. And we're all human. We miss certain things. We may have a very limited amount of time in working with a victim because we have to get back to court, or because you have somebody else waiting, or you have another call to answer if you're law enforcement. And so those safety planning suggestions are often really helpful in that they pinpoint the risk to these particular situations. And so what SHARP does, and you can find it both at coercivecontrol.org or stalkingrisk.com, is that assessment looks at 14 different risk factors. Now, what you need to know is SHARP does have a lot of questions. Okay, there's 47 questions on the assessment, and I know many of you probably just rolled your eyes at the screen. Keep in mind that the assessment takes less than 10 minutes to do. I can do a SHARP assessment in about 5 minutes because I'm super familiar with the questions. They're like yes, no questions. They're on a Likert scale, so highly likely, unlikely, etc. So it does not take as long as it might sound. SHARP looks at the 14 different risk factors in stalking cases, including what has been the course of conduct in this particular situation. What kind of sly behaviors has the offender been engaging in? Are they monitoring the victim's behavior? Are they interfering with the victim's life? Are they trying to sabotage the victim's finances, their work? And are they intimidating the victim? It also looks to see if there has been an escalation in these particular situations. Has the offender's behavior continued to escalate, or is there a potential upcoming trigger? What you all need to know is that if we're involved as the criminal justice system, chances are there's potential trigger coming up because the offender is being held accountable. So if there's an upcoming court case, if somebody's looking at being arrested for these particular behaviors, that's a potential trigger. It also looks at the nature and the context of threats in stalking cases. What we need to keep in mind is when we're looking at threats in stalking cases, how does the offender have the capability of following through with those threats? How are those threats being communicated? Are they being sent directly to the victim? Are they being put on a public facing, like social media site, etc.? And how capable is the offender to follow through with those threats? Have they made threats before and then followed through with them? One of the things that oftentimes happens in stalking cases is threats that are made via social media, etc., are oftentimes not looked at as immediate threats. And we have to keep in mind that social media has become so common in our everyday lives that threats via social media, etc., absolutely have the potential of being followed through by the offender. But what happens in a lot of instances is people say, well, it was just a threat on Facebook, or it was just a threat through social media. Keep in mind that offenders oftentimes are engaging in numerous tactics to be able to target their victim. And we also, as we're looking at their threatening behavior, etc., want to determine how persistent has the offender been. Has the offender been told to stop, either informally, because the victim has told them to stop or someone else has, or formally, meaning there's some kind of criminal or civil order that's in place, and they're continuing to persist in their behavior? Red flag for us, right? We also want to determine what's the stalker's motive. Are they trying to get back together with the victim? Are they seeking some type of revenge on the victim because they blame them for ruining their life? And are they engaging in that proxy stalking behavior? One of the places where we see proxy stalking happening pretty frequently is after the offender has been arrested and they use their jail phone call to call their buddy, their friend, and say, you go and talk to the victim and you tell that victim they better come down here and bail me out of jail right away. Are you looking at jail calls? Is somebody reviewing jail calls as part of these cases? We see a lot of proxy stalking and intimidation by witness happening through those particular phone calls. SHARP also evaluates the history of this particular offender, both towards this particular victim, but towards other people as well. So what's been the history of domestic violence in these cases? Does the offender have access to firearms, or do they have training on those firearms? So people who are currently or formerly part of the military, if they were law enforcement, do they have access to weapons and some kind of training on those weapons? It also looks at the offender's criminal history, their mental health status, as well as substance abuse. Now, keep in mind, oftentimes people want to look at stalking offenders and say that there's some kind of mental health issue. Do not confuse mental health issues with power and control. Very typically, there are power and control issues that are happening in these particular cases, and that behavior to people who don't engage in power and control does not seem normal, but that does not mean it's an issue of mental health, okay? Stats will actually tell you that the number of individuals who are stalkers who have mental health issues is pretty low. Also keep in mind that it will not be unusual to have a stalking offender who has a clean criminal history. These offenders are very good at doing what they're doing. They are very adept at talking their way out of things, at pretending that things that have been happening are just a misunderstanding, or that, oh my goodness, the victim's actually stalking them. So keep in mind that you might have an offender who has a very clean criminal history because of their ability to talk themselves out of these things. Clearly, if we have an offender who has drug or alcohol abuse issues, that contributes to the violence, doesn't cause it, but certainly contributes. And then we also look to see how vulnerable is our victim. Do they happen to share children in common? Do they work together? Do they live in a really small town where they have to see each other all the time? And what's been the impact on the victim's life? One of the questions that I often ask victims of stalking when we're working with them is to ask things like, what has changed for you since all of this started? And you might have a victim who doesn't necessarily articulate fear or emotional distress as a named emotion, but everything in their life has changed for them. They don't drive the same way to school. They've gotten a Ring camera. They have people walk them back and forth to their car. They don't let their kids play out in the front yard by themselves. All signs of the impact that the stalking has had on their life, including things like, I'm not eating and sleeping well. We also examine, is the offender using some kind of technology? It would be very unusual in this day and age to have a case that doesn't involve some sort of technology. Keeping in mind, even phones are technology, right? As well as how vulnerable is our victim. And when we look at these 14 particular risk factors in stalking cases, it's one thing to be able to have this list and to think about the case that you're working on, et cetera, and try to go through it and be like, okay, is there an escalation, et cetera? But it's probably more helpful to actually do the assessment itself. And I know some of you are like, Jennifer, there is absolutely no way we could do a risk assessment on scene with a victim in the hallway of a courthouse because I only have 10 minutes. But keeping in mind that if there has been an intimate partner risk assessment, okay, no matter which assessment you're using, and those questions were answered yes, that we talked about earlier about jealous and controlling behavior, et cetera, then that might indicate to us that we need to delve deeper and do a stalking risk assessment. SPARC also has the questions to SHARP in a Word document that we're willing to share with you all. It's definitely more helpful if you're actually inputting it into the system to see the results of that risk assessment. But there's a lot of different ways that you can at least identify those particular stalking behaviors and then think about doing additional assessment for risk in these particular situations. So if you're using some kind of assessment like the LAP or the danger assessment or mosaic or something else, and you answer yes to those questions about jealousy, et cetera, that may indicate to you that you need to do additional assessment on stalking. Because as I said earlier, oftentimes those stalking behaviors are overlooked. They're missed as far as being additional risk factors in these particular cases. And then as we identify risk, thinking about how are we then also safety planning with the individuals who are being targeted in these stalking situations, safety planning with those victims. And what we know from research is that victims are most afraid of not knowing what's going to happen next. Where is the offender going to show up? What are they going to do? Now, certainly they also fear all the other things listed on your screen. But I want to, in particular, talk about the not knowing what will happen next, because what oftentimes happens in these particular cases is victims of stalking develop a very high sense of hypervigilance. And so they might be somewhere and they see someone in a blue baseball cap, and then they get a message from the stalker that says, you know, why are you spending my child support money at the grocery store? And the victim's like, is this person in this blue baseball cap supplying information to my stalker? Like, how do they know I was at the grocery store? And then later in the day, they see somebody else in a blue baseball cap and they think, is this person following me? Are they providing information to somebody? Do I need to not be, you know, going around town doing errands right now, et cetera? And that sense of hypervigilance that oftentimes happens in these particular cases gets labeled by people who don't understand hypervigilance as paranoia. And people are very quick to say, you know, the victim's making things up and this can't really happen, especially if there's some kind of technology that's being used in these particular cases. And that hypervigilance that victims of stalking have developed has been what's kept them safe. And so rather than labeling it as paranoia, et cetera, we need to acknowledge that just like in sexual assault and domestic violence cases, victims develop a very high sense of hypervigilance. And victims cope in different ways to that stalking. Some of them will actually physically try to move away from the offender. They might be prohibited in doing so if they share custody, et cetera. Some of them will try to make a report to law enforcement, apply for civil protection order. Some of them isolate themselves from friends and family, or they move outwards and try to get help from advocacy agencies, et cetera. The one thing that's listed on the screen that people have a tendency to not be able to wrap our heads around is the moving towards the offender. And we all understand, I hope, the dynamics in intimate partner situations and why victims of intimate partner violence continue to engage and have interactions with the person who harms them. But what we also need to keep in mind is dynamics are similar in stalking cases. Clearly, if it's an intimate partner situation, but also for non-intimate partner situations. And that victims of stalking oftentimes are engaging with stalkers because they're doing a temperature check. They're trying to minimize the threat. Let me give you an example. If you're working with a stalking victim and that stalker has been having daily contact, they're showing up all the time, calling all the time, they're texting all the time, and then all of a sudden the victim calls you and says, I haven't heard from them in 48 hours. None of us are like, oh, cool, stalking case is over, let's move on. Most of us are like, uh-oh, what's that offender doing? What are they thinking? When is the other shoe gonna drop? And victims feel the same way. And because of that, oftentimes they are making contact with the offender because they're trying to figure out what's going on. They're trying to negotiate for their safety. And especially in intimate partner stalking cases, they've spent years trying to talk this person down. And so they will engage with that person in an effort to try to de-escalate the situation. But all the time I hear people say, well, it can't be that dangerous of a situation. We don't need to do risk assessment because if it's really so scary, why would the victim be making contact with the offender? Because it's really so scary. Many victims of stalking will engage with the offender. Now, it's ideal in these situations to advise that the victim doesn't have any contact with the offender. Offenders will take any type of engagement as reinforcement. Going to court is reinforcement because they get to see the victim. Showing up to contest the civil protection order is reinforcement because they get to see the victim. So keep in mind that while disengagement is ideal, it's not always realistic, especially if it's an intimate partner situation. And that many victims of stalking will make contact because they're trying to negotiate for their safety. And so then as folks are doing risk assessment, because hopefully we've convinced you now that you should be in stalking cases, thinking about the coordinating response of, okay, so now that we've identified risk, how do we safety plan with these individuals who are in these particular situations? And my experience has been that when folks are safety planning about risk in stalking cases, that they oftentimes default to tactical safety planning. So they will tell victims of stalking things like, oh, you should get a Ring camera and you should make sure that somebody walks you back and forth to your car after work. And we miss the emotional safety planning part of things that we're pretty skilled at usually doing as part of domestic violence cases, but we sometimes have a tendency to forget in stalking cases because we're so focused on the practical, tactical pieces of safety planning. Keeping in mind that when you're identifying risk, making sure that victims are put in contact with a variety of agencies that can help them. The difficulty in a lot of these particular situations is that victims of stalking are oftentimes walking that very fine line of how do I balance my safety with also having the freedom to live my life. People very frequently tell victims of stalking, well, get off social media and change your phone number and pretty much isolate yourself in your house. That's not realistic. We should instead be focused on the how do we hold offenders accountable through doing things like risk assessment. But we should also be thinking about how do we consider what the stalker's next tactic might be. That's why I said that risk assessment has to be dynamic. It has to be done at different periods of time because risk is always changing in stalking cases. And that safety planning has to evolve. And we need to trust victims' instincts in these particular situations. Thinking about what the offender might do next and asking victims, what do you think the offender is going to do if we hold them in jail and they get out? Or if they are, fined or whatever might happen in their criminal case, what do you think their response is going to be? That's where that SLY framework can also be super helpful because it can help us talk about the other behaviors that the offender might be engaging in. The other thing that we need to be thinking about when it comes to stalking cases is that oftentimes we are relying on the individuals who are stalked to help supply the evidence. Really, there's not another crime where we essentially say to the victims, go back and gather all the evidence and bring it to us. And oftentimes people are telling victims to keep a journal in these particular cases. And what should be happening is that they're keeping some kind of incident logs. These incident logs are available on the SPARC website in English and in Spanish. And on one side of them has the log that you actually see. And then on the other side has instructions to victims on how to keep the log. And so thinking about, as we're looking at these particular cases, helping identify what's been happening, being able to keep evidence, et cetera, is oftentimes relying on traumatized victims. And so providing them with tools like incident logs might be helpful in these particular situations so that we can gather all the information and so that we can properly assess risk in these particular cases. So please check these out on our website, download them, use them in your particular cases as well. And to that end, I just want to provide all of you again with the Stalking Awareness website. You can look on that particular website for additional information for those of you that are law enforcement. We have lots of guides for law enforcement, for prosecutors, for victim advocates, as well as information for victims themselves. Now, SPARC does not work with victims directly, so please do not refer them to our office because we will then in turn have to refer them to their local agencies or local resources. But there's a lot of information on there that you can use in your work with victims. So check out that website, sign up for our newsletter because we're constantly letting you know if there are additional resources that we are developing. And then I've also included my contact information. Best way to get a hold of any of us is to go to our website. There's contact information there. You can find additional information on risk assessment, etc. And we're happy to provide additional training to you as you embark on looking at risk assessment in these particular cases. So I just want to thank all of you for participating in this particular webinar, for looking at this particular video. We know that the work that you do is vital, and we are so thankful for the work that you're doing to increase the safety of victims and to hold offenders accountable in these particular cases. If you have any questions, please reach out to us and we're happy to provide assistance. Thanks.